I'm Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. For anyone who manages a business, labor is one of those elements, like government or the economy, that makes up the business environment. However well a manager may be able to control a business's overhead, sales, or production, the manager still has to work with things which can't be controlled, such as labor. The labor environment influences business and business decisions in a multitude of ways. And even though the manager may not be able to control labor, the manager must be aware of its influence and plan for it. Now, what is a labor union? Why do people join them? How does unionization affect a business? What changes are ahead for labor management relations? Those are some of the questions we'll be asking in this half hour as we examine business and labor relations. Now, we'll be going to Washington, D.C. to talk with a representative of one of the oldest and most powerful unions in the country. We'll also be going to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to visit with someone who can tell us how management looks at unions. And finally, we'll visit with a longtime observer of the labor scene. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is our first guest, Vicki Saporta, Director of Organizing for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Ms. Saporta is a graduate of Cornell University and spent 10 years as a Teamster field organizer before assuming her present position. As Director of Organizing, she is responsible for bringing new members to the Teamsters. Ms. Saporta, thank you for taking the time to share your experience and expertise with us.
Thank you, Alex.
Tell me, in your view, what is a labor union?
Unions are basically a group of people who get together to bargain collectively with their employer over wages, benefits, hours, and working conditions. In order to achieve ends that are beneficial to our membership, we also sometimes get very active legislatively for legislation such as health and safety legislation, minimum wage type legislation, various types of social legislation as well. Workers, when they get together, have more bargaining power with an employer than they can possibly have individually, one-on-one.
What do you see as the result of having a union in the workplace?
I think the most important thing that unions do is to give workers dignity and respect in the workplace. And they do that by putting workers on an equal level with management in determining the conditions under which they work. It gives them a voice in determining the conditions, and it gives them some recourse. And a contract gives them protections that they don't have and could never have in a workplace where no written contract exists. Most people don't realize that employers in this country, unlike a lot of other countries, really can unilaterally do whatever they want in a workplace if they don't violate certain key laws, which are very few and far between. And in order to get the kind of protection and job security and job dignity, there's no substitute for a union contract.
All right, people gain dignity, respect, and protection. Good. But would you expand a little more on why people join unions?
It's the only way that workers have of getting on an equal footing with their employer. Unions bring democracy to the workplace. Right now, in most companies, in most situations, if a worker is having problems or if they don't like certain working conditions or if the wages and benefits are not adequate, the only recourse they have is to hit the door. Federal legislation was passed years ago to make it possible for workers to organize and bargain collectively. It says that if you're an employee working at a certain place of employment, you don't have to hit the door, that you can sit down with a group of your employees and bargain over the kinds of wages, benefits, hours, and working conditions that you're willing to work under.
What's the impact of a union contract on the workplace? How does it affect the rights of the workers and management?
Once it is in effect, a contract provides some written rules in terms of the workplace, so that employers, when they want to change something, cannot do it unilaterally, have to follow the terms that are in the contract. Most employers, when they don't have a union contract, they usually have some employee handbook or work rules, but there's no obligation whatsoever to follow those rules. And when they're not followed, employees have no recourse. With a contract, when one of those provisions is broken, someone is laid off out of seniority, for example, or they try to, they're looking to take something away or to make a change. They can't do it, and they can't do it unilaterally. And so you have a grievance procedure that's built in, and it more or less stabilizes the workforce. A lot of managers are surprised after they get a union voted in. They think it's the end of the world. And then once they see that a contract isn't the worst thing in the world, many have said, it gives us a basis to operate under, and we have rules and regulations. It makes our operating almost easier. And what it does most importantly is gives employees a stake in their company. They're building up seniority rights. They're building up vacation benefits. They're building up pension credits. So you have a more stabilized workforce. You have less turnover taking place. And you basically have a workplace where employees feel they have some recourse, and they become oftentimes more productive and better employees, long-term employees, and employees who feel they're being paid wages and benefits that are fair and just. And it does give them some, again, dignity and respect.
It's a given that unions and management don't always see eye to eye. So what tools, what strategies does a union have when it's dealing with management?
And we're always looking for new strategies. You may say the strike was one strategy, boycotts were another. The corporate campaign is something that is coming up in recent years. Unions have been, reaching out to each other in terms of trying to form coalitions. There's public relations aspect where you can put pressure on. And we're always looking for new and different ways to bring our membership the greatest clout at the bargaining table. So our bargaining power is increased. And we'll be developing new kinds of strategies and techniques, such as the corporate campaign. You can get in the whole legislative end of things, too, where unions put pressure legislatively to achieve some of their ends, whether you can go through labor legislation reform or whether you go through just in public employee-type situations.
All right, then, how do you see relations between labor and management evolving, positively or negatively?
In order for them to evolve in a positive direction, management needs to accept the fact that unions have a place, they have a role, and a job to do for our membership, and accept the right that we have to exist in this country, which I don't think they're at that point.
Wait a minute. That's what management has to do. But what about labor?
I think labor has demonstrated its willingness to work with management for the benefit of our membership. We've been in situations where companies are operating in the red, where they're in a position to go bankrupt, and where we've worked with management in terms of sometimes negotiating like ESOP plans in exchange for a temporary wage freeze or a wage cut, and have tried to do what we can to keep companies viable. It doesn't help the labor movement for management not to be profitable and for companies to be going out of business. A healthy management can afford to pay higher wages and higher benefits to our members and to our membership.
It would seem, Vicki, what you're saying is that management and labor are mutually dependent on each other. So is there a key here to better labor management relations?
There has to be some kind of mutual trust, and I just really don't think that there is a mutual trust, and I don't think with the actions that most management have taken over the past few years that trust is going to increase by any step of the imagination. We have certain very good relationships with certain individual companies, and labor relations have evolved in a positive direction. But overall, it there seems to be an increasing resistance to unions and an increasing trend toward management to really engage in illegal tactics, to keep unions out, to try to decertify them, deauthorize them, etc. And if that continues to be the trend, labor relations can't be evolving in a real positive kind of manner.
Vicki, we need to move on now to Quinn Mills in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But later in the program, I'm going to make a mental note to pursue the issue of trust, which you raised. Once again, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Alex.
D. Quinn Mills is a professor of business administration at Harvard University. He also acts as a consultant, especially on labor relations, to various corporations, and he'll be giving us management's perspective. Professor Mills, thanks for letting us visit with you today.
Glad to have you, Alex.
We just spoke with Vicki Saporta of the Teamsters, who told us, from labor's point of view, why people join unions. Now, as someone who has worked with the top management of many different companies, how would you answer that question?
Well, I think unions suggest to people that if they join the unions can get them better wages and working conditions and those kind of things. But when it comes down to why people vote to join a union, when ordinarily the management is opposed to it, I think the reason is because management supervisors aren't doing their job well. They're not being responsive to the people. They're not paying attention to their needs, so that people vote to join a union because they want someone to deal with management on their behalf. It's really a management failure.
Now let me clarify this. You're saying that when management doesn't pay attention and respond to people's needs, that's when a union is voted in. Well, what actually happens to the work environment when a business becomes unionized?
Well, when a union comes into a company, a contract has to be negotiated. The company and the union have to make a set of rules. They have to agree on a set of rules by which they will each conduct themselves. They have to establish wage levels and working conditions and benefits and all of those things. And that takes a while. And that's a process that's very disruptive. People don't know what the outcomes will be. The union is worried about what the results will be, and the company is worried as well. The employee is kind of in the middle. The union represents the employee, but the employee has a foot in both camps, if you will. And that's a long process, and it's a disruptive process. Once a contract is reached, then the rules spell out what the union's responsibilities are and the company's. One of the very important things that happens is that everything is now much more formal. If an employee wants to know whether he or she can do something, there is a rule book. There is a union contract to be consulted. And if the company doesn't obey that contract to the letter, the union has a grievance procedure by which they bring up the issue and raise it with the company. And if the company is violating that agreement and doesn't recognize it, then the union takes the company into a procedure where an arbitrator tells the company it has to do that. So it's a much more formal process. And a lot of the one-to-one relationships and the informality of the system is lost.
All right, in this new, as you say, formal relationship, what happens to the rights of workers and management?
Lawyers on both sides, for the union and the employer, tend to make the rules, which the employee and the supervisors will have to live by. If you think a bit further about it, when it comes to a grievance, the individual worker can register a complaint with the union, and the union then thinks about and decides whether or not to take it to the company. If the union decides not to take it to the company, then the employee's complaint generally doesn't go anywhere. And if the union should decide that it's not all that important a complaint and they raise it with the company but don't pursue it very vigorously, the employee again doesn't have any other recourse for the most part. Furthermore, and finally, there's a lot of red tape associated with this process, so that an employee has rights and the union represents him, but it's a slow and legal and laborious process that may take months and months before an employee's complaint gets a fair hearing. So the employee has rights, and I think the union probably does its best to support those rights. But it's a slow, long process, and it's not a very flexible or a quick process.
Vicki Saporta described several options labor has in dealing with management. What sort of tools or strategies does management have in dealing with labor?
Well, management has a number of tools in dealing with a union. One of them, of course, is the right not to sign a contract. Another one is the right to insist on what management thinks are reasonable and fair provisions in those contracts. A company does not have to agree to whatever a union suggests or demands. If a union strikes, a company has the right to hire replacements for the strikers. People who strike gamble with their jobs. If the company can replace them, it often will. I think the company also has the opportunity to lock employees out who strike. We don't like to talk about that, but if the union strikes for things the company can't afford, the company, or if the union doesn't strike but demands things that the company can't afford, the company can close the plant and tell the employees not to come to work. So there are a lot of tools that the company has. Those aren't the best way to deal with unions or with labor relations, however. The best way is to have a strategy to be fair with the union and yet firm about the management's rights and prerogatives, and to hope that the union and the employees will be sensible and that lockouts and strikes and replacements simply don't occur.
Well, speaking for management, how do you see labor management relations changing, evolving?
Well, I hope they're going to be getting better. It's a very competitive economy now. We have competition from abroad, and we have competition from non-union companies in the United States. Our labor costs are high. The people who work for us want a better standard of living, but it's very hard for us to get business in a market that's this competitive. So we hope that the union is going to work with the company to try to keep us competitive in the marketplace so that we can provide jobs and decent wage rates and benefits for our employees.
Well, then, based on what you just said, what are the chances for labor and management growing into a partnership with each other? What would they have to do to achieve that?
Well, there's considerable potential for a partnership to evolve between the union and the company. But it requires the union to recognize some things that the union is often unwilling to recognize. The first one is that we have to have productivity. We have to have an efficient operation. And the union has got to agree to work rules and conditions that let us be cost effective in the marketplace. Otherwise, we can't get the business, we can't provide the jobs, and we can't provide good wages and benefits. Productivity is very important to us, and having flexibility and adaptability in the way we organize and run our production shops is extremely important to us. The unions too often do not recognize that. They put high cost and inflexible rules in our way, and we simply can't compete in the marketplace. Second thing is we're very anxious that they be supportive of our company and allow the employees to feel that they're a part of the company, to be loyal to it, to feel that supervisors and managers care about them as well, so that the employee can make a commitment to his or her work and do a good job for us. Do a job that's competitive, that has high quality, and will help the company survive. So we need productivity, and we need the commitment of the employees and the unions to make us successful. Now, on our side, on management side, we have a responsibility to obey the union contract, to conduct ourselves in accordance with the provisions of that contract. We have a responsibility to take the concerns of our employees seriously and to respond to them when they're legitimate. And to not substitute our own views for those of the employees. And we will try to train our managers and supervisors to do that. So if we're fair with the employees, and if the union's prepared to let us have a productive and efficient workplace, then there's a basis for a partnership. Otherwise, there's only a basis for disagreement and arguments and difficulties.
All right, all right. We have one more stop on our schedule, but before we leave, Dr. Mills, I want to thank you for letting us visit.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's been nice to have you here.
That's management's perspective. Now, to get a neutral point of view, we're going back to Washington, D.C. to talk with Ben Burdetsky. He's the Associate Dean of the School of Government and Business Administration at George Washington University. He has also served as an executive in the Department of Labor. Dr. Burdetsky, thanks for taking this time to talk with us.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to participate in this program.
Dr. Burdetsky, I want you to comment on some of the remarks that our other guests have made. But before you do, I wonder if you could explain what factors affect the operating relationship between management and labor.
Well, the key factors that affect this relationship, obviously the economy. When the economy is strong and there are jobs, People are working. Obviously, they get along a lot better. Obviously, companies feel more powerful about their relationship when there are jobs that they can control better. When there are fewer jobs and people are bidding for jobs, then obviously they're in a much stronger power position. So the economy is a very important consideration. And workers are rather reluctant to take serious action when it's difficult to find work. And that has happened. So I think the economy would be obviously number one. I would add competition. Some of our basic smokestack industries where labor has been strongest in organizing over the years have been in serious trouble. Steel industry, autos, shoe manufacturing. We've lost a lot of industries to foreign competition. And so they take the attitude, we're in it together. And if we don't get together, we're going to be in serious trouble. We've lost some basic industries to foreign production. And I think steel and autos are good examples of where they've had to get together and work together for common survival.
Earlier, we spoke with Vicki Saporta and Quinn Mills on the possibilities for labor and management developing a more positive partner relationship. Mr. Mills was hopeful, but Ms. Saporta wasn't as optimistic. So what do you think?
Well, first, Alex, I think I'd like to make a point that I haven't heard mentioned very often. There are thousands of union contracts negotiated every year that we never hear about. They're settled, they're signed, there's a handshake, and people get along very well. We hear about those real troubling type cases that affect the general health of the economy or a large segment of the population and something that's of that level. So I would say right off that I think things aren't really that bad. Now, on the other hand, there are some areas that need improvement, and there are some steps that have already been taken or suggested that can help get at that.
If you would speak to that a bit, what sort of actions are necessary by both management and labor to develop this relationship?
Well, on a basic level, I think there has to be an understanding that there's a mutual interest in survival, and they've got to get along better than we have in the past. In the United States, more than any other country, we've had a confrontational relationship from the beginning. Management manages, makes its decisions, and unions watch very carefully everything they do and challenge those areas that they think affect the members. And very often that's led to strife. They have not looked upon each other in a really cooperative, participative way. But in recent years, the last couple of years, have been a number of efforts. Joint labor management cooperative committees, for example, are one way. And there are a number of industries where that has been applied, and it usually comes about after there's been some serious crisis that's taken place.
Can you give us some examples?
The retail food industry is a good example, where they constant battles and bickering over things, and they have joined together over 10 years now in an excellent labor management cooperative venture. The steel industry has widespread labor management cooperative committees. General Motors has instituted something that the Japanese developed, quality control circles, which not only interested in quality of work, which we've had some problems with, but worker participation. The word worker participation, I think, is the word of the 80s and the 90s. Getting workers involved in the decision-making, with the assumption being that they are involved and they feel reasonably secure about their work, that they'll do a better job. They'll be more productive. They have good ideas. Some of the best ideas are down at the shop level. And we invented all this stuff, by the way, 25 years ago. And the Japanese came along and they've introduced it. They're now famous for their worker participation, their quality circles. So there are many ways in which you can involve employees more directly in the decision-making process, and through that device, showing that you're interested in them and they're feeling that you really do care, they'll get involved and give you good support. So I think worker involvement, worker participation are excellent words that ought to be applied real practically. I think the other words that trust. You've got to trust each other. You're in it together. If a firm is productive and effective, it'll generate more jobs. If it generates more jobs, more workers, more union members, you really have ways in which this thing can assist and support each other. So my point would be worker cooperation, worker participation, mutual trust and respect.
I'm glad you mentioned trust, Dr. Burdetsky. I had told Vicki Saporta I'd raise that point again, but you did it for me. And I'm afraid we're out of time. You've been very helpful. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed this opportunity to participate with you.
The labor environment is a dynamic one. We've seen its intensity, its multiple objectives, and its potential for conflict or for partnership. And we've also examined some of the critical ingredients for developing positive relationships between business and labor. A business person must be aware of the dynamics of this environment. To ignore the labor environment is to avoid reality. But to understand its influence and to work with it as a variable which affects decision-making is a necessity. I'm Alex Burton, and this has been The Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.